A man named Gary, 53, had a knack for adventure and a deep-rooted love for the wilderness. He constantly sought new ways to challenge himself and test his survival skills. His latest ambition was to spend an entire week in the rugged Sonoran Desert in eastern Colorado, a location known for its unforgiving climate and isolation. Although his wife worried every time he set out on these solo excursions, believing it was too risky, Gary thrived on the thrill of true survival. For him, there was no sense of accomplishment without genuine stakes. Survival meant facing real danger, relying on himself, and pushing his limits. So, despite his wife's pleas to stay safe, he headed into the desert with just the essentials: water, a tent, a knife, his survival kit, and the clothes he was wearing. Once he parked his car at the edge of the wilderness, Gary made a conscious decision to leave his phone behind, opting instead for a disposable camera. For him, survival meant disconnecting entirely, trusting only his instincts and knowledge. He packed his gear into a sturdy backpack, took one last look at the modern world, and walked into the vast, empty landscape, ready for the solitude ahead. The desert sprawled out before him, its beauty accentuated by the silence and intense heat. A few hours before sunset, Gary spotted a large, rocky formation that would offer decent shelter for the night. He made his way over, noting that this spot was perfect. Its natural windbreak would keep his tent stable, and the shadows cast by the rock provided some much-needed respite from the scorching sun. Once his tent was set up, he lit a small campfire, took a quick picture of the striking rock against the fading light, and settled down for a quiet night. As he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the desert's nocturnal sounds, he had no idea that his sense of isolation would soon be shattered. In the middle of the night, Gary was jolted awake by an eerie, distant sound. He held his breath, listening intently. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as the sound grew louder, it took on an unmistakably human quality. A deep, chilling scream that echoed across the open desert. Gary's pulse quickened as he lay motionless in his sleeping bag, trying to decide if he should investigate. The screaming persisted, each cry louder than the last. He reached for his knife, his only means of protection, and pulled himself deeper into his tent, hoping the noise would eventually fade. But just as he thought it had stopped, the scream resurfaced, much closer now, cutting through the silence like a knife. Moments later, he heard the roar of an engine and saw two beams of headlights piercing through the dark. Gathering his courage, Gary unzipped his tent and climbed onto the rocky formation to get a better view. With his flashlight off, he watched as a car sped toward his campsite, its engine echoing across the desert landscape. He quickly crouched down, praying he hadn't been seen. Just as he feared, the car stopped a short distance away. Two men emerged, their flashlights scanning the desert floor. Gary's heart pounded as he watched them unload a large, box-like object from the back of the truck. The men then walked towards his location, one of them holding a gun. Gary's survival instincts kicked in. He quickly ducked behind a boulder, doing his best to stay hidden. The men called out into the darkness, their voices dripping with suspicion. "Hey, we know someone's here," they shouted, the beams of their flashlights drawing closer to his hiding spot. Gary's grip tightened around his knife as he wondered what they would do if they found him. Just as he was about to bolt, he heard a third voice, distant yet commanding. The men immediately froze, then yelled back, "Yes, sir." They hurriedly climbed back into the vehicle, leaving the box on the ground. Moments later, the car roared back to life and sped off into the night. Gary remained frozen for a few minutes, trying to calm his nerves and make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, he gathered his gear, packed up his campsite, and made his way back to his car, casting wary glances behind him as he went. When he finally reached his vehicle, relief washed over him, but questions lingered in his mind. Days later, as he unpacked his disposable camera photos, he noticed something chilling in the picture he'd taken in front of the rock. Behind him, just barely visible, was the faint glow of a light within a cave. He quickly reported it to the police and soon learned that the authorities had uncovered a hideout for a notorious fugitive, Khan Madras, wanted for drug trafficking. Gary's accidental discovery made headlines, his snapshot leading to the capture of one of the country's most wanted criminals. Dubbed an anonymous hero, he was awarded a sizable reward and newfound respect for his daring escapade. He'd ventured into the desert seeking adventure, and he'd returned a hero with a story that he'd be telling for years to come. Gary felt a pang of guilt as he tucked his phone away in the glove compartment, knowing his wife would never approve. If she knew he was going into the desert without it, she'd be furious. But to him, that was part of the adventure, total isolation, free from the safety net of technology. He had about 2 hours of daylight left to find a spot for his tent, so he set off, ignoring the warning signs around him that read, "Do not enter the desert alone and beware of extreme heat." After walking a few kilometers, the signs disappeared, and he found himself entirely alone in the vast wilderness. He spotted a large rock formation up ahead, the perfect shelter for setting up his tent, sheltered from the wind and away from the open. Sunset was just around the corner, so he quickly pitched his tent and lit a small fire, savoring the quiet as the stars began to dot the sky. He admired the beauty of the rocky outcrop in front of him, snapping a quick photo before the last light faded. With the night settling in, he extinguished the fire and crawled into his tent, soothed by the wilderness sounds around him. Exhausted, he quickly drifted off to sleep, feeling the thrill of solitude. In the middle of the night, a piercing noise jolted him awake. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he lay still, listening, the sound grew louder, a strange, almost human scream that echoed across the desert. His heart pounded as he strained to make out what it could be, his initial excitement about the trip fading into unease. Whatever it was getting closer. The noise continued, an eerie wail that made his skin crawl. He debated going outside to investigate but decided against it, hoping the sound would fade. The screams persisted, growing nearer, until they sounded alarmingly close. Holding his breath, he listened intently and realized that it was indeed a human voice. He reached for his knife, his only means of defense, and scooted further down into his sleeping bag, his heart racing with every passing second. As he lay there, he thought of his wife's concerns, realizing now just how risky his choice to go without a phone had been. It was clear now he wasn't alone, and the thrill he had sought had turned into a fear he hadn't anticipated. Gripping the knife tightly, he lay silent, hoping whatever, or whoever, was out there would pass by without noticing him. Just then, a distant motorcycle engine broke the silence. The growl of another vehicle soon joined, and both sounds grew louder, closing in quickly. Gary's pulse quickened as he sat up in his tent, listening intently. Carefully, he unzipped the tent flap and peeked out, but he could see nothing in the dark expanse around him. He decided to get a better view from a nearby rock, grabbing his flashlight and climbing up slowly, the desert pitch black except for his narrow beam of light. Reaching the top of the rock, Gary looked out, and his heart lurched. 2 glaring headlights were speeding toward him in the distance. He quickly turned off his flashlight, crouching down behind the rock as dread settled over him. Who would be out here in the middle of the desert at this hour? And had they seen him? He held his breath as the vehicle neared, the headlights bouncing over the rugged terrain. About 200 meters away, it stopped. Gary watched as 2 men stepped out of the truck, each holding a flashlight. They moved to the back of the vehicle and unloaded a large package, placing it heavily on the ground. It looked like a box, maybe even a crate. A chill ran down his spine as he watched them stride toward the rocks. They stopped about 100 meters from his hiding place, their flashlights sweeping the area. It was then that Gary noticed one of the men holding a gun. Suddenly, the flashlight beam swung toward his direction. One of the men shouted, "Hey, show yourself." Gary's stomach clenched as he ducked back behind the rock, pressing his body into the rough surface, barely daring to breathe. Every second felt excruciatingly long as he waited, his mind racing. His wife had been right. What was he thinking, coming here alone and without his phone? All he could think about was getting back home and holding her, but right now, he had no idea if he'd even make it out of the desert. The men's voices grew louder as they moved around, and the one with the gun shouted again, "Where are you?" Each word ratcheted up Gary's terror. He knew it was only a matter of time before they found his tent and discovered he was nearby. His fingers tightened around his flashlight, wishing it were something more useful. Just as he began to inch his way back down, a third voice cut through the silence, loud and commanding. The voice seemed to come from behind the men, not from the ground, but from somewhere higher up. It called out to them, and immediately the two men with flashlights froze. "Yes, sir," one of them replied, looking up into the darkness. They turned quickly, walked back to the truck, and climbed in without a word. The headlights flared again, and within moments, they were driving away, their taillights disappearing into the distance. Gary let out a shaky breath, peering cautiously over the edge of the rock to confirm they were gone. He was alone once more. Relieved but rattled, he scrambled back to his tent, packed his things as fast as he could, and bolted from the campsite, determined to put as much distance as possible between him and that rock. The trek back to his car felt endless, every sound in the dark amplifying his anxiety. But at last, he spotted his vehicle and practically threw himself inside. He drove straight home, his mind replaying the night's events in disbelief. Later, as he hugged his wife, he promised her he'd never go into the wilderness alone again. But despite everything, one question lingered in his mind. Who had those men been, and what had they left behind in that mysterious box? The mysterious voice came from above rather than the ground, commanding the two men with such authority that they instantly obeyed, responding with, "Yes, sir." They climbed back into their vehicle and sped away. Gary waited, holding his breath, until he was certain they were gone. Only when silence returned did he cautiously emerge from his hiding spot, peering over the rock to see that the coast was clear. Relieved yet still shaken, he quickly returned to his tent, gathered his belongings, and made his way out of the desert. Using his compass for guidance, Gary retraced his steps through the silent terrain until he reached his car. As he drove home, he replayed the night's events over and over in his mind, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. The first thing he did upon arrival was hug his wife, and with a newfound appreciation for her concerns, he vowed never to venture into the wilderness alone again. Yet, even after resuming his daily routine, Gary couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. His mind kept returning to that dark desert night. Days later, his wife returned home with the developed photos from his disposable camera. Eagerly, Gary flipped through them, reliving the journey, but one picture stopped him in his tracks. In the shot of him standing in front of the massive rock, he noticed something he hadn't seen at the time, a faint, eerie glow coming from what appeared to be a hidden cave behind him. His heart pounded as he inspected the photo, the implications of the light dawning on him. Without a second thought, he turned to his wife and said, "Call the police right now." Gary handed the photo over to authorities, prompting an immediate investigation. The police soon made a shocking discovery. The cave in the picture was a hidden hideout belonging to none other than Con Madras, a notorious drug lord who had been on the run since escaping prison 2 months prior. By sheer luck, Gary's photo had revealed Madras's location, enabling the police to track him down and bring him to justice. News of Gary's incredible find spread quickly, capturing nationwide attention. Headlines hailed him as a hero. Hiker accidentally leads police to fugitive's hideout. His story became an overnight sensation, transforming a simple survival trip into a tale of accidental heroism. Adding to the surprise, Gary was awarded a $1,000 reward for his tip-off, bringing him both recognition and a sense of pride. Reflecting on the experience, Gary couldn't help but marvel at the twist his adventure had taken. What began as a wilderness escape, meant to be a break from society, ended up connecting him with one of the country's most wanted criminals. The encounter taught him the importance of heeding his wife's concerns and gave him a newfound respect for the unpredictable turns life can take. Gary returned from the desert not only a little wealthier and wiser, but with a story that would be shared for years. A reminder that even the most ordinary adventures can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes.